This is part one of a video series where I'm going to build a complete HO scale layout on this small portable shelf unit, which measures 1 foot by approximately 4 foot. The reason why I'm doing this is I want to be able to, number one, document in a simple YouTube video series on how to produce a model railroad and demonstrate all the latest techniques of laying track, wiring, hooking up the various DCC systems, programming locomotives, etc. When this is complete, I want to be able to take this to train shows, to conventions, and give some tutorials and really document and demonstrate how cool this hobby can be and the technology that goes into model railroading in the year 2020. So as I progress as building this layout, I want to share that this will have a lot of advanced technologies on it. I will be using all Digitrack's DCC system and various components from Digitrack's to make this and really document and demonstrate what a modern HO scale railroad can do. I'm going to have track or locomotive detection and transponding capabilities. This will have signaling capabilities. I will have all of the frogs on the switches or the turnouts power routed, and really I'm going to do this again in a step-by-step fashion to really document and demonstrate how easy it is to do this. About the only thing that this video series is not going to address, it's the actual construction of the benchwork. The reason why I did that was I had my brother, who's a woodworker, actually make this case for me, and I'll show you the construction here in just a second. But constructing the benchwork for a model railroad really is going to be dependent upon the type of layout that you are assembling, the space needs, etc. There's a lot of internet resources that can really help guide you on proper benchwork for a model railroad. So before I get too far into this video, I do just want to show you the benchwork on this. So this is a fully enclosed case. The top lifts off. There are a couple hook latches to hold it in place. One is on the other end where it's out of sight of the camera. But basically that'll keep the top held in place while I'm transporting it. This will flip up. And the reason why it's designed like this, for people to want to see how the wiring of an HO scale layout is with the various DCC components. I have it set up so we'll be able to flip it up. I'm going to mount all the modules up on the top and then run wires down to the DCC system. The construction in this is pretty simple. It's just the 3/4 inch plywood, cut it to shape, whatever you need. It's just tack nailed together, glued together. The bottom was designed, we took a look at the size of the Digitrack Zephyr Express DCC system, so that'll be placed right here. I have a small 9-inch screen laptop which I'll be sitting right here for the programming track and to use JMRI. And you can see I already ran some power strips in here, drilled a hole out the back. So all of the electrical components will be maintained inside the case here, and then all I have to do is just plug in this extension cord which is on the back side of the layout. This is a piano hinge, and then just a little bracket to keep the top benchwork in place so it doesn't fall down and plunk somebody in the head. So this is the benchwork, and again, pretty simple. It's just a standard box made out of plywood. So your benchwork is really going to be dependent upon your track plan, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth here on designing a track plan. I've always maintained you need to do what works best for you, what you want to accomplish with your layout. It's always good to get feedback from other people, but at the end of the day, this is going to be your layout. It's really your identity as a model railroader. So do what you want to do and be confident in what you want to do. There are going to be people who are going to critique what your plans are. You know what? If it works for you and you're happy with it and it accomplishes what you want, go for it. what we ended up doing, and I know it's a little bit difficult to see right now because we stained the plywood sort of a dark ink color. We have a computerized engraver, and we can see that we actually engraved the track plan into the side of the bench here. The reason why, when we get this fully hooked up and running, I say we, it's going to be me doing it. My brother helped make the bench, but that's it. I'm going to drill LEDs into this. I'm going to have LED indicators for the turnouts using the Digitrax detecting software or detecting modules. We're going to be able to have LEDs that are going to show the positions of the trains on the layout. So I wanted to have a track plan. I'll eventually paint the actual track plan in a contrasting color so you can see it better. And then it'll eventually have LEDs on it. So this is what the track plan is going to look like. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time muddling through how I design my track plan. But once we get started with the actual laying of the track, this is what it's going to be like. So this entire layout is going to be made with Walther's turnouts and Atlas flex track. Couple theories behind this, and again, this is one of the things with model railroading. You stick with what works best for you. Atlas and other manufacturers make snap track, which are the straights are usually in 9-inch pieces. They'll have various radius turns. You can get anywhere from 15-inch radius up to a 22-inch radius. The thing with the flex or the snap track is every time you join track to one another, you have the tendency or the ability to get a short in the connection between the rails. Now, using good rail joiners is going to be key. Having a lot of feeders on your track is going to be key to making sure that you have good electrical connectivity. If you don't have good electrical connection, you're going to always fight locomotive shorting out, erratic behavior of your locomotives, and it becomes very frustrating. So a lot of model railroaders like using flex track. You can get jigs that can flex it or bend it into the various radius turns that you're trying to put on your railroad. The nice thing with flex track is it comes in 3-foot pieces, and it limits the number of joints that you're going to have on your layout, thus limiting the amounts of places that your locomotives could get an electrical short. So the other thing you have to take into consideration are your turnouts. You want to make sure on a DCC system that you have DCC friendly turnouts. You can see right here the frog is electrically isolated, so there's a double gap there and there to isolate the frog. If we flip these over, one of the nice things about these Walther's turnouts, you can see that they have, I know it's probably reflecting pretty good, they actually have some wires that are connecting the rails here, 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 here. And really what that does is it just ensures that you're getting good electrical connectivity between the various rails of the turnout. So you want to make sure you're getting DCC friendly turnouts if you're using a DCC system, because if that frog is not electrically isolated, you're going to get shorts. If your if the throw bar for your point rails is not electrically isolated, you're going to have again electrical shorts. So you can modify some non-DCC friendly turnouts to make them DCC friendly. I'll put a website in the video description that will help you with some DCC wiring, but that's what you're going to be looking for when you're doing your track purchasing. Another thing you have to take into consideration when you're purchasing your track is it usually comes predominantly in what are called codes, and there's predominantly 3 types of codes. There's code 100, code 87, I'm sorry, code 83, and code 70 track. What the code is, it is the actual height of the rail. A lot of people believe that code 83 track is probably as close to the prototypical rail height as possible, so it's 83 thousandths of an inch high, whereas Code 100 is a little bit taller, code 70 is a little bit shorter. I use code 83 predominantly. The thing with it, you cannot mix and match codes unless you have a joiner track. Now, some manufacturers will actually produce track that transitions from code 83 to code 70 or code 100 down to code 83, but I couldn't take a piece of code 70 track or code 100 track and connect it to a code 83 track, because the gap or the height of the rail differences is going to cause your locomotives and rolling stock to more than likely derail. So you just have to, again, pay attention to what you're purchasing. I'll be honest with you, model railroad track lasts for a very long time. Some of the stuff that I have on my layout downstairs in my basement is track from when I first got into this hobby as a kid, 25, 30 years ago. You want to make sure that you have a nice clean rail, that it's not dirty or roughed up anywhere, there's no paint on it, because again, you want to make sure that you get that good electrical connectivity with your locomotive electrical pickup wheels. Okay, with that brief bit of background information, we are officially ready to start laying track on this HO scale layout. So I know it's a little bit premature to have a locomotive and a piece of rolling stock on the layout here, but what I need to do is I need to mark, I'm going to do a little bit of switching on this layout, and I at least want to be able to use a first generation 4-axle diesel and a 40-foot piece of rolling stock. In this case, it's a high cube box car, because I need to make sure that I can set the turnouts that gives me enough clearance where I can park the locomotive and the rolling stock and still be able to throw the point rails of the turnout. So I have this in place here, and I'm going to basically make a simple crossover. So I'm going to mark where the edge of the axle or the edge of the wheels of the locomotive are, and then I'm going to do that on the right side of the layout, and then I can set where I need to put my turnout location, and then I'll be able to start cutting the track. So basically what I'm going to do is I just have a little pencil here, so make a couple marks in between the rails, so I can set where the point rails, minimum clearance where the point rails have to be. So at this point I'm just going to sort of spot place my turnout. So now I'm going to move the rolling stock and the locomotive to the other end. Okay, so similar deal, I'm just going to mark in between the rails of where the point rails have to be, and I'm just going to sort of spot check where the points have to be. So now you can see I have really the minimum clearance of where the turnout has to be. So you can see that the diverging rail of both of these turnouts overlap. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark on the rails where I need to make my cuts, and I'm going to use my Dremel tool, and we're going to cut those diverging rails and get these two turnouts put together. So I have the turnouts set where I want them to, and I basically have a Sharpie here, and what I'm going to do, I have these set pretty well equal distance to where, and I'm using the rail guards here as sort of my guide. I'm going to make just a couple marks with a Sharpie here on the rail of where I'm actually going to cut through the rail, and I'm going to do that on both turnouts. And I'm actually going to go a little bit longer than what I actually need, because you can always cut more off if you need to. You can't ever add, well, I shouldn't say you can't ever add. You can add rail. It's not easy to do. But I'm going to cut these a little long and then just continue to use my Dremel tool to be able to get them put in place. Okay, so I have my Dremel tool and I've got my cutting wheel on it. For safety purposes, I'm not actually going to videotape cutting the rail. I don't want to it produces a lot of small hot metal shards. I don't want to expose the camera lens with them flying all over. Plus, I need to make sure that I do this correctly. But the key to doing this is you kind of want to put your rail over a surface that you can hold the cutting tool perpendicular to the rail. You want to get as straight of a cut as possible when you're doing it. So if you're trying to do it on a flat surface like this and you can't get your Dremel angled properly, it's going to cut it at an angle. So I usually just go over the edge of a surface, make sure that I can hold my cutting tool perpendicular to the rail so I get a nice straight cut. So I'm going to turn the camera off. I'm going to make these cuts, and then I will come back and show you the finished product. Okay, I'm done making the cuts, so you can kind of see right here and here where the cuts are. Now the next thing I'm going to do, the ties actually run the complete width of the turnout on both of these. So I'm just going to take my shop knife, and I'm just going to gently and carefully start cutting the ties so we can get this chunk of track off the turnout. So I'm just going to use my shop knife, cut these off. I'm going to pause the camera here so you don't have to watch me do this. It'll take probably 4 or 5 minutes to cut the ties, and then we'll be back with our trimmed out turnouts. Okay, got the rails off there. So these will fit together quite nicely. What I need to do is I need to trim these outer ties down because they're kind of coming into contact with the ties on the straight route of this turnout. So I'm going to pause the camera one more time. I'm going to trim those ties down, and it looks like these will fit nicely into place. So there we go. We have these all assembled. These came together unbelievably nicely. You can tell the cuts are actually right there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have to pop these two rails out here. I'm going to put a rail joiner in between there, and I usually don't do this, but because I don't have a lot of space in between where the isolation points are for the frogs, I'm actually going to solder these together to ensure that I get a good electrical connection between these rails. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these off, get a rail joiner on here, and then I'll show you soldering these together. Okay, so we got these turnouts soldered together, and you just sort of see the underside of them here. You can see the two joiners. So what I'm going to do is I've got one more turnout that goes right here, and just for consistency's sake, I am going to solder this turnout to these other two as well. So I'll walk you through the steps on how I solder my rails together. I'll go into the soldering a little bit more in depth in the part of the video where I solder the feeders to the rails, but I'll give you a quick rundown of all the parts and pieces you need to get some effective soldering. First and foremost, you definitely need a solid soldering iron. I use a Weller. Make sure the tip is clean. It's going to make sure that you transfer the heat and get a good clean joint or connection. You need some solder, tip cleaner, and some flux over here. Anytime I use track and I lay the track down, I always use brand new rail joiners. So these are brand new rail joiners. Again, the goal of all of this is to make sure that we get a good solid electrical connection. Used rail joiners, especially ones that you've used multiple times, they tend to loosen. They don't have a good fit. The part where it curls over and hugs the rail tends to bend out over time. So you can use, and I will actually use some used rail joiners when I'm putting the straight track down just to get it in place and to mark it. But before I do my final install, I'm going to use brand new rail joiners. Okay, Okay, so here we go. I apologize, I'm trying to work behind the camera and make sure that everything is in focus on top of doing things correctly. It's a little bit challenging. So those fit on really, really tight and solid. So we're going to make sure these fit nice and solid. They do. I'm just going to quick eyeball my track here to make sure it looks straight. It's off just a little bit. There we go. So those are ready to go. I'm going to do a little bit of solder on each side. I put some flux on here. This flux just really helps the solder distribute evenly when we heat it up. One thing about flux, it makes a fairly monumental mess when the solder burns it off or the soldering iron burns it off. So you do have to do a little bit of cleaning when you're done. So basically what I'm going to do, I've got my solder. In this example, I'm using a .015 diameter 6236-2 silver bearing solder. Some solder has flux in it. Most model railroad publications don't recommend the use of flux in your solder. So basically you just heat the joint up. Once the joint gets heated, you can see the solder starting to flow. And just make sure the solder is nice and even across the joint there. Perfect. So you got a nice shiny silver joint. So I'm going to do that on both sides of each rail joiner. So I'm going to pause the video and get this done real quick, and we'll come back and continue working on with the track laying. Okay, I got those soldered up. So I'm done with my soldering iron for right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean the tip off here a little bit. This is just a tip cleaner. You always want to make sure that you have your tip nice and tinned before you shut your iron off, because if it gets corroded or starts to, if it's just not clean, it doesn't transfer the heat real well and you'll have a really difficult time soldering. So we're done with the soldering iron for right now. Let's go ahead and continue on with the track laying. So when you're laying track on a model railroad, you really need to figure out at what point or where you need to get your turnouts placed to ensure you're going to get the operations that you need to or desiring to. So if you're trying to set it for a certain size industry, or if you're trying to set it for connection with a yard or a spur or something like that, you want to make sure that your turnouts are appropriately located. So this whole layout here is absolutely critically dependent upon the location of this trio of turnouts, because it's a small layout. I want to be able to use a first generation diesel with at least a 40-foot box car to do some switching. So again, going back to one of my earlier segments in this video, I've got a locomotive and a box car. So I'm going to, again, eyeball it and set it to where this cluster of turnouts will allow me to at least have enough space to have a locomotive and a car on either side of both of these turnouts. So I'm just going to go ahead and spot this here and see where we're at. Okay, so I'm just going to start on the right side of the layout here. So I have my locomotive and box car set up, and I've got about a finger width set between the front coupler or the front of the locomotive and where the the point rails are in the turnout. So now I'm going to go ahead and move this to the other side and see how much space, and I'm really going to focus on trying to get these two turnouts right here centered on the layout. Okay, so similar right here, I've got a finger width between the point rails and the front of the locomotive, so these turnouts are pretty well set. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set where the secondary line runs. There's going to be a turnout on that as well. So I'm going to set that in close proximity to where this cluster of turnouts is and make sure everything is spaced appropriately and it's where I want it before I start cutting my flex track. So here I'm going to give you just a secondary perspective. So I'm at the left edge of my layout looking towards the right. So what the goal is here, I'm going to set a piece of flex track here, somewhere approximately here. And then I also am going to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the piece that's going to come off and curve here. These pieces will go straight, shouldn't be an issue. And then again up here, the diverging route, it's going to curve off, and I want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the main line. So I'm going to slide it in here just slightly. I'm going to kind of estimate where this piece will end, probably right somewhere about like that. So I'm going to set this. We should have enough clearance with this diverging rail coming off here, those rails going off there. So the purpose of the secondary line is, I'm going to use detection zones on the layout, and I want to have 2 detection zones before I get to this turnout, because I'm going to set up a signaling system, and I want to have 2 detection zones before getting to this turnout in the diverging route, so we can do some automation of the signal. So I want to have 2 signal blocks prior to getting to this turnout. So I'm actually going to start sliding this down because I want to have at least the width of 2 locomotives right here to set the detection zone. So let me grab my locomotive and sort of space this out here. Okay, so there's right there. I'm just going to mark this. Okay, I'll have plenty of space. Even if I did decide to use a 6-axle diesel on this, I'll have plenty of space. So that turnout is pretty well spaced. I'm going to use my locomotive and boxcar so I can sort of replicate a train sitting on the siding or sitting on the diverging route, again, when it comes down to the automatic signaling that I'm going to use on this layout. Okay, I have the turnout locations set exactly how I want them. So the next step is going to be to put some markings down. Again, I'm just going to use my pencil to sort of put some markings down on where these tracks go. Now I'm going to start measuring and cutting some flex track. Okay, so I have these all set, and I'm just using a little bit of, depending on what part of the country you're in, I've always called this masking tape. Some people call it painter's tape. I think painter's tape's blue, so this is masking tape to me. But I just set this in place with some masking tape. So as I'm setting where I want to start cutting the rails, that it holds the turnouts in place. So really now it's just a matter of starting to set where the rails are, making sure on this flex track one piece is designed to flex within the ties. So you just want to make sure you get a good flush connection here. I'm going to get it set, and I'm going to take my Sharpie and mark where I want it to cut. Again, I'm going to use my Dremel cutting tool. I'm going to do that off camera just for my personal protection and the camera's protection. So I'm going to cut this rail, and I'll be back and show you how it fits. Okay, so here's the piece I just cut. See, it fits perfect. I have about 1/4 inch gap between the edge of the rail and the edge of my bench. I'm going to build little stoppers on here since this is a shelf layout. There is the risk of running trains or rolling stock off the edge of the rail, so I'm going to build something up to make sure that the rails don't fall off. These flex track pieces are about 3 foot in length, so this piece here. Still have adequate length to be able to get that last piece cut, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that and get this one cut as well. Okay, so we got that second piece run. You can see the track runs nice and straight. I'm going to cut the pieces for all these parallel tracks, get the rest of them cut. I'm going to do this off camera, so that's the gist of how you cut straight track for doing an HO scale layout. When I do one of these diverging lines, I will show you how to do that because it gives you an idea or a sense for how to cut curved straight track or curved flex track. So I'm going to get the remaining straights cut, and then I'll do the diverging at the end on camera. Okay, so you can see I've got all the straight track cut on my layout here. So now I just got two pieces to cut. The diverging route that goes off of that turnout, and then the diverging route that goes off of that turnout right there. And I'm going to show you how to do that with flex track. So when you're working on curved pieces like this, there's a couple different thoughts on how to do it. So when you're working with flex track, one rail is fixed to the ties and one rail is loose, and that allows us to give it the bend. So if you see, as I bend the track, you can see that outer rail actually moves within the ties. So I've got a couple pieces of masking tape here. I'm going to make sure the rails are flush to the turnout. I'm actually going to put just a couple pieces of tape down here. You certainly can use rail joiners if you so choose. Mostly I just want to kind of spot hold this in place. I'm going to keep my hand hold it in place too. And we're just going to get it set approximately where I want it. Because what's going to happen is when we cut this outer rail actually will have a longer length than the shorter rail, because the outer rail has a farther distance to travel around the arc of the circle. So you want to make sure that it's flush up here. I'm going to take and mark it out here at the outer edge with my Sharpie, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it. So here's the piece I just cut. You can see on the back side these rails are flush with the rear tie. On the front here you can see this rail is probably a solid 3/16 to maybe a 1/4 inch longer than the inside rail. So again, when we go to bend this, you can see that inside rail actually moves because it's a longer arc around the radius of the turn or the curve in the track, and therefore it's going to fit. So I'm going to go ahead and get this taped in place, and I'll show you how it looks. So here you can see how it looks. Have all four of these rails. Again, this one's the curved one we just cut off the turnout. We've got one more to cut on the other end, and then we will be done with cutting of the track of this layout. Okay, so there you go. We have all the track ready for this layout. Give you a quick pan both directions. A couple things I really like about this. I pulled my tape measure out. There's an equal distance between the rails on both ends of this. So whether that was by design or just pure luck, that's the way it ended up. I don't have rail joiners on this yet. I'm going to grab a piece of rolling stock. Even though I don't have rail joiners, I've got a good connection between the rails, or at least they're pretty close. So I'm going to get a piece of rolling stock and just roll it through the turnouts here and just double check, make sure everything works. And then we'll move on to the next stage of the build. So one of the techniques I'm going to try in this layout is I'm going to draw a wiring scheme on the underside of the lid of the shelf layout here. And this is something I've never tried before, but I've read about it. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the track plan onto the underside of the bench here. And the main purpose of this, again, is for demonstration purposes, taking it and showing it to new modelers or inexperienced modelers, so it'll have a visual reference of where the rails are. So when we have all the wires coming down from the top of the layout, it'll put it in perspective on where the wires actually are at. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tape measure and pencil and just start measuring out where the sections of track start, where the turnouts are, and I'm just going to begin drawing the track plan on the underside of the layout. So I'm going to do my best to draw exactly where the rails are at. So this rail here is going to be the first one because it's going to start from the top working down, and it's 3 1/16 of an inch in from the edge of the layout. So I'm just going to flip the top up here and take my handy pencil and just start marking where this rail is at 3 1/16, 3 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to pencil the line in across the top of the layout, or the underside. Okay, so I have these marked. I've got a straight edge. The other thing I did was I marked where the double gaps are going to be between the rails, and I'll get more into that in the wiring section of the video series. Make sure that's lined up. So I'm just going to lightly, because I'm going to go through later and trace over this with a Sharpie, I'm just going to lightly draw where this rail is. So this line here corresponds, and it should be really close to this rail right here. So I'm just going to continue to replicate this process here, measure in the next rail. I'm just going to keep working down the bench of the, or down the surface of the track layout here. Have to think outside the box on this because this will be inverted on the other side, the opposite side. So as you're drawing it, or as I'm drawing it, I just have to think in reverse of how the track actually is on the other side. So I'm going to keep tracing this in, and once I get this all traced in, I'll come back and show you what I'm going to do with the Sharpies. Okay, so I was able to get everything traced. I traced my entire layout on the inside of the lid of the box here, and you can see I did the double gaps signified with a green Sharpie. I know the green looks a little bit dark. Red, black, so those are going to be rail A and rail B. Rail A will be red, rail B will be black. You can see that I traced the frogs in green. Here's just a tighter shot of everything. So the purpose of doing this, it's not to figure out where to drill the holes or the wires or anything, but it basically gives me a reference point. That's always been one of the things that I found to be somewhat challenging working on a model railroad on the underside is you don't exactly know where the rails are. So this just gives me a reference as I am working underneath here, and it's also going to give the opportunity to make fewer mistakes if you know this is supposed to be a red rail or a black rail and the wire coming through the layout doesn't match the schematics here. We know that there are some issues associated with it, so it should help troubleshoot, and it's just a good visual for, again, displaying this layout and giving people an idea of where the wires are. I'm going to be able to mount the Tortoise switch machines underneath here and just give perspective on where everything is at. I did have a little help in getting the layout traced, so what I ended up doing was I took a turnout to work, photocopied it. So this is an actual size of a Walther's left-hand number 5 turnout. Made a couple copies of it. This one, to get the curves right for the drawing, I just took it and cut it out on the inside of the rail, covered it in some contact paper so I had a little bit more of a firm surface. Made a copy of the frog, covered that in contact paper. Made a copy of the rails that come off the point rails that guide just a real simple tip and technique is to photocopy track and cut it out and just start laying it out to see if things will fit. So what I just did is not necessary technique for you to use in your model railroad, but before I got too far along in the project, I wanted to get that completed. So the next step is I'm going to put the cork roadbed down, and basically to do that I need to mark where the rails are so I know where to apply the cork. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply start to trace along the outer edge of all of these rails so I have a reference point of where the ties end. I'm also going to take my Sharpie and I'm going to make several markers or markings right in the center of each tie, and that'll allow me to draw a center line down where each of the lines run so I know how to get my cork lined up. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. So you can see I have a straight edge here, and basically what I'm going to do is since these are only taped down, I'm going to take my Sharpie, and again I'm just going to make a couple reference dots right in the center line between the rails. And then what I'm going to do is, now that I have this as a reference, I'm going to go ahead and pull the tape off. This down to make sure it's nice and flush. There it is. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the tie up. Missing a piece of tape here. So I'm going to pull this rail up. Go ahead and mark it. And that'll signify where the outer edge of the rail is. So then I'm just going to continue on this process and get all of the track traced on the top side of the layout, and we'll be ready to start laying the cork. Okay, so outer tie, inner tie, center line. I know it's not perfectly centered. This line is probably a little bit closer to the inside of the tie because I couldn't get my straight edge in between these two rails, so I guessed it. But what I'm going to do, just to make sure that I don't mess up where this track goes, I put a number 1 here, and I've got all this leftover tape, and I'm just going to put a number 1 on this, and then I'm going to put the direction of right with an arrow pointing to that direction. So I'm going to put this on here so I know this is piece number 1. This is facing the layout, the right orientation with an arrow this way, so I know that this piece of track goes back in the exact same spot that it was when we had it laid down. So I'm going to continue this process and get the rest of the track marked for the cork. Okay, so you can see that I got all the track marked, center lines drawn for where I'm going to put the cork. I'm actually going to use 2 different sizes of cork. This is just standard HO scale modeling cork. It's about 5 millimeters thick. I'm going to use this for what I'm calling the main line of this railroad because prototypically main lines are set at a little bit higher grade than a lot of yards or spurs. And then I have this cork roll here. This is about 3 millimeter height. So I'm going to do this front line with the left-handed turnout, and I'm going to do that at a little bit smaller grade. Again, this is just something that I'm doing to enhance the realism of this layout. You can certainly do all of it with the standard modeling cork. So let's go ahead and show you how to get started with cork. Okay, so to start installing the cork roadbed, we need a few supplies here that'll help make this task a little bit more user-friendly for you. So obviously you have the cork, having a good straight edge, especially for cutting pieces, even if you wanted to use it, excuse me, a T-square, shop knife with a good sharp blade, and I have some thumbtacks that are going to keep the cork secure in place as I'm cutting and measuring it out, and then tape measure. And then you're also going to, this part is optional. I'm actually going to use some liquid nails to adhere it to the plywood. You can certainly just use some track nails and tack it down that way. It's just whatever works best for you. And then when we're all said and done, you're going to need a sanding block with some fine grit sandpaper to sand it down, make sure everything is nice and smooth before we lay the track. So if you've never worked with cork roadbed before, it comes in 3-foot sections, so same length as a piece of straight flex track. And by nature, you can see that this edge here, it's flat, it's just a perpendicular edge. But there's a score in the middle here, and there's a bevel on it. It's very advisable to and to make it go around turns, you're going to have to cut it at the score, and then we're going to have the bevel edge out, so it sort of simulates prototypical elevated right away, and to keep, for drainage issues and things like that, and to put the ballast down. So basically you just fold it over on the bevel, and you're going to take your shop knife that's again very sharp, just put it from the back side of the bevel, and you just gently cut it. Do that from both directions. And now you have two separate pieces of cork, and again, we're going to turn this so the bevel edge is actually going to be facing outward from the ties. Now, a couple things when you cut it, and I'm not sure how well you can see it here, but there's like a little bit of an edge or a lip here on the top side, so this would be outward facing, and you'll be able to see that. I'm just going to take and lay this on a flat surface. I'm just going to again use my sharp knife and just sort of score and work that off, and when we're all done, we can use the sanding block and sand that piece off as well. So since the overall width of this shelf layout is approximately about 43 inches, these pieces of cork are 36 inches. If I lay it from one end to the other, you can see that it goes from left edge to about 8 or so inches away from the right edge of the plywood. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to measure this out, and I'm going to cut it right at the midpoint. So I have equal distance of cork on either side, and I'm going to try to keep all the seams pretty much right in the middle. At the end of the day, we're not going to be able to see the seams anyway because we're going to ballast over them, but there is absolutely nothing wrong, and I'll preface that. There's nothing wrong if you wanted to lay this piece here without cutting it and then splicing in on the end. There is nothing wrong with that, but I'm just going to try to get all the seams right in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and measure and cut this, and we're going to start installing. Okay, so taking one piece of cork, cutting it to half distance of the top of the layout, I can now take that one split piece of cork and I can actually lay it on the outer edge of track, and it fits the entire width of the layout. So if you remember a few minutes ago, when we actually traced the track, we put the mark for where the center line actually is. So I'm going to line these up to where the center line is, and just to temporarily hold them in place, I have a tiny little thumbtack here. I'm just going to gently push it down, and it's going to keep that in some semblance of place where I want it until we're ready to start adhering it to the layout. So I'm just going to put 2 or 3 pieces in, just sort of, or two or three tacks and just hold these pieces in place. Okay, I'm going to do that on the second piece, and then we'll continue on with the installation. So you can see that I put this trio of turnouts back on top of the cork here, because basically what I'm going to do is, because it's going to be almost impossible to get these bevels underneath it, I'm actually going to put full pieces of uncut in between here, and I'll still run the bevels along the outer edges so you'll be able to see it. So I'm just trying to estimate where would be a great place to start, where these blocks are going to go, to make it look, you know, to fill this whole area in and give it enough support that as the locomotives and really stock are going over it, that we don't have any sagging of the track anywhere. So pretty much going to start it from here and do it down to about right where that set of ties starts to protrude out. So I'm going to pull these off and start cutting non-scored intact pieces of cork. Okay, so I'm just going to put that piece in there just like that. And again, we'll just set this turnout back in here, or these sets of turnouts in here, just for reference purposes. This is a scrap piece or a spare piece from one of the previous cuts that I just made, so I'll go ahead and get that lined up with this center line. So now it's just going to be a matter of filling in the rest of these pieces and to make the curve off into that little side spur. Okay, so I had to make a slight change in plans. I ended up running solid core all the way from the outer edge to the inner edge where this last turnout was, because basically I have these rails so close together that the bevels from these two sets of tracks was really, they were butting up against one another, and it would not have looked quite right trying to ballast it. So I ended up basically just making, have the beveled outer edge here, 2 pieces of, or well, one piece of solid core, unbroken cork in the middle, and then I run the bevel along the outer side and had to put an extra piece in here because of the spur. So I have those pieces ready to go now, and these are about 5 millimeters thick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now cut my other sheet of cork, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically cut that piece of cork so it fits right up flush against the 5 millimeter piece of cork. So this cork is 24 wide, 48 long, and since the overall width of my layout is 43 or so inches, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this out lengthwise, and that's why I need my straight edge. I'm actually going to trim off, so this will be one solid piece of cork that goes all the way the full width of the layout. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this down to the width of the layout, and then we'll start working on cutting it to fit where the secondary tracks are going to go. Okay, so this is super easy to cut, so I cut at the width of the layout, and then I measured at the far end there how wide the turnout and the turnout and the spur is. So I cut it the width that I want it, and then basically I'm just going to line it up with the marker that I made. Come down here. Okay, that fits nice and sturdy right there. And basically what I'm going to do is, once I get this lined up where I want it, I'm just going to take my blade and I'm just going to follow along where that outer piece of cork is, and I'm going to score that piece off. Okay, so I got that cut and fit into place. So this is going to give me just a little bit of variation in the height between the rails. This the track over here is going to be just about 2 millimeters higher than this track over here, so it's just going to give it a little bit of a prototypical appearance in terms of some of the track elevation differences. So all of this cork is now cut and it is marked and it's ready to be secured in place. Again, you can do one of a couple things. You can absolutely tack it down with track nails. In this case, I'm just going to use my liquid nails here. So I'm going to pull all of this up, apply liquid nails, and then reset all of this, and I'm going to put some weights on top of it and let it sit and dry. Okay, so I set the cork off the track, or off the bench work here, and now I'm just going to use some liquid glue, and we're just going to start spreading this out.
Okay.
So we'll just get this spread out across the entire section that we're going to glue the cork, and then we'll come back and start reinstalling the cork. Okay, you can see that I got the glue all spread out with a small trowel, and now it's just a matter of putting all the cork pieces back where they were when we started. Okay, so I have everything glued down, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some wax paper over top of this, and I'm going to put some cornhole bags on it for weight to hold this in place, but everything glued down nicely. So we're going to let this set up and get dried. I did have to put a couple tack pins back in right there, but overall the glue works really well. It holds it nice and secure in place. So I just, again, put some wax paper down over top to make sure that I didn't get any glue on my cornhole bags, but these have a lot of weight to them, and they're a little bit flexible, so it just gives us a little bit of weight to hold the cork in place while the glue dries. Okay, so I gave the cork probably about a solid 7-8 hours to dry and set up. Took the weights off. Real happy with how this turned out. Everything's nice and solid. Just have a simple sanding block here. Just going to gently run it over. Make sure there's no... Generally this turned out real smooth. But just make sure that there's no rough edges, because you want everything to be as smooth as possible for when you're laying the track down, so you have a nice smooth surface. Because if there's any sort of undulations or change in the height of the cork, it could cause your track to not seat properly, and then you're going to fight derailments and all sorts of issues. So I'm just going to run the sanding block over this a few more times. Get a little wet towel, wipe it off, get all the sawdust off or the small parts of the cork, and then we're ready to start replacing our track. So this really sort of become a good news, bad news situation. The good news is, well, let me rephrase that. The bad news is we corked over all the marks of where the track was, but the good news is we have all the parts of track cut, and I know how this is going to fit. So now it's just going to be a matter of putting the track back in place. Now, a couple things that I'm going to do that I didn't do on the original track sizing and placement. So if you notice here, the edge of these turnouts, the ties go all the way to the end, and it's solid underneath. So I don't have the ability to put a rail joiner on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shop knife and I'm going to cut this set of ties off anywhere on these Walther turnouts. I'm going to cut the last tie out, and it's going to give me an opportunity to slip the rail joiners on. So I'm actually going to put the rail joiners on. So I'm going to take my shop knife, just a small piece of plastic that's holding them into place. Just pop it. Hardly even have to put any pressure on it, and then that'll just slide right off. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have to do that on the flex track as well, because on the flex track the tie is run all the way to the end. So I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes cutting the edges of the ties off, and then we'll start with our second to last placement of the track. Okay, so I got the pieces back where they originally were. Again, if you remember, I marked these with masking tape. I took a photograph of where the pieces went because I wrote them down on the surface of the plywood. Obviously, I corked over it, but took a picture of it, so I made sure these got back in the same place. One thing about FlexTrack, and I didn't bring this part up when I originally was cutting it, there's no nail holes in any of these FlexTracks. But on the back side, and I don't know how well this will show on camera, like right there where my thumb is, there are some mold marks to where to drill through the ties for track nails. So I'm going to secure these with some of my push pins. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to got my drill bit, got like a 32nd inch bit on here. So I'm just going to carefully drill through a few of these. I'm not going to drill through every one. They're about 12 ties. So I'm going to drill through a few of these because that's going to help in the final assembly when I permanently lay the track onto the layout. Okay, so on a quote-unquote normal layout, what I would do is I've just got some old rail joiners here, and I would take these old rail joiners because I'm not done yet. I'm going to start. We got one more step before we're ready to do final installation, but I would take these old rail joiners and start connecting the pieces. What I'm going to do, and I'm going to explain this more in the second part of this video series, I'm actually going to put plastic rail joiners everywhere. Everywhere there's a gap in the track right now, there's going to be a plastic rail joiner. And the reason why is because I'm going to wire this layout for locomotive detection and rolling stock detection on rolling stock that have resistor wheel sets. So in order to do that, you have to have sections of track that are electrically isolated. In a normal DCC layout, we would just put metal rail joiners on all of this. But since I'm going to do detection, I need to have electrically isolated sections of track so the DCC system knows where the locomotive and equipped rolling stock are at. So I'm actually going to put the plastic rail joiners on now, and they're just going to stay in place because I'm going to create those electrical gaps. So the turnouts are going to be electrically isolated from the rest of the layout, and all of the straight pieces of track are going to become detectable sections of layout. So I was able to get the rest of the track secured in place. So you can see this is the final placement of the track in terms of where I want it, the location, everything looks good. Again, I use these push pins to hold the track in place. A couple reasons why. Number one, you can use track nails if you want to. And if you were going to secure the track and not plan on pulling it up anymore, I would actually have used track nails at this point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder the feeders and then pull the track up, spray paint everything so it spray paints over the solder joints to the rails, and then I'm going to permanently install the track onto the layout, and at that point I'll use track nails. So we're just about done getting the track permanently placed. This is still temporary till I'm able to get the turnouts, or I'm sorry, the feeder wire soldered, and then we're going to go ahead and start working on the wiring, which will be part 2 of this video. Again, if we lift the lid up here, you can see that on the inside we have the track map with the color indications of either the black rail or the red rail. So that'll come in handy when we get into the second part of the video when we start to talk about track wiring. So before I get too much farther along, it's always a great idea to just double check and test out some rolling stock to make sure you don't have any kinks anywhere, any derailments. Make sure that it rolls over your turnouts. I have to keep an eye on this. My garage floor is sloped for drainage. So we're just gonna double check, make sure everything rolls nice and freely. That's the other thing I like about these push pins. The profile of them is below the height of the rail, so I can push a piece of rolling stock over it and not have to worry about the coupler catching on it and causing some issues. Okay, so no issues there. I'm gonna grab, I did bring my GP9 locomotive out, so I'm just gonna double check to make sure that I didn't mess anything up with the placement of the turnouts and the track. So I'm gonna grab that real quick. So again, my goal, my purpose was to be able to get first generation diesel and a 40-foot piece of rolling stock on that piece of track there to be able to throw the turnout. I've got plenty of room. And then we'll just roll it down here to this end. So again, I've got adequate space here. Can still throw the turnout. We'll be able to, do some single car switching on here, which is what I wanted to do. I've got one more piece of rolling stock here I'm going to bring out. So these tracks are pretty close together, so I've just got another piece of rolling stock here that I wanted to bring out. I think what I'm going to do, and just by looking at it, this rail right here, this sort of side spur, I think it's a little bit farther to the right than what I would like. It's getting pretty close to this locomotive, so I think before I do my soldering, I'm going to pull this last tack pin up here and move this track to the left a little bit. And again, that's why you just want to double check and test everything before you get your track permanently placed, to make sure you don't run into any issues where you're going to have to redo your track after you permanently install it. So good thing I double checked that real quick, so I'm actually going to fix that right now. There we go, much better. Again, just want to make sure we don't have any issues of it, any collisions or any hitting, and we're good. I know these are already good because I've checked them already. Again, we got a good gap in between there. Again, I'm not going to have a whole lot of locomotives or rolling stock out on this because it's more of a test track than anything. But again, you still want to be able to make sure that you don't have any issues. So it's always good to double check before you get too far down to where something doesn't work and you have to redo an entire section. Okay, so that concludes part 1 of this video. Hope you enjoyed learning about how to lay track, how to lay cork, and get everything in place. So phase 2, or step 2 of this layout, is going to be to start the wiring process. So first part of my second part of the video series, we're going to start to do some soldering. I will show you some basic soldering techniques, but basically we're going to start soldering feeder wires in, and then start running the bus line and getting things to the point where we're able to start powering this up and checking to make sure that we have a working layout. So I hope you enjoyed part 1. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to post them in the comments, or you can always reach out to me separately. You can find my email address. So thank you very much. Happy railroading.